Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome to part 3 in our series with Hill of Doves, the Legion Wargames solitaire wargame of the First Anglo-Boer War. In this episode, we're going to pick up where we left off in part 2. We're going to finish the week, we're going to go through resupplying the front, we're also going to go through the whole strategic turn. Let's jump in and get started, lots to cover. When we last left off, we had just successfully assaulted O'Neill's farm, taking our first of the additional 9 objectives we would need to get to have a victory in this game. Let's continue on with the start of Thursday. So we're going to switch up now and go to our 4th day. And so we're moving from Wednesday into Thursday, middle of the week here. That's by the guidance of the Start the Day segment. Our next action is to roll for weather, hoping that the rain breaks here. Excellent, we get a 1. So that means the weather clears up, we have sun, and we get out of deep mud, which is good because that means the double drifts is open, as we shall see shortly here. Card number 3 is the night assault segment, and what I want to do in this video too is to talk just briefly, we're not going to go through them, but just talk briefly about some of the cases and some of the things that we haven't done in this series. One of these is night assaults. Now you get, as the British player, you get 3 night assaults in the game, so you have to be a little judicious when you use them. There can be advantages to them because of a lack of supporting forces. The resistance at some of these positions can be lighter, but there are some risks involved, so you kind of want to judge how you might want to be able to use those. But this again shows the idea that within the game there's quite a bit of variety as to when you assault, and how you build up these attacks. So I think there's a lot of depth to gameplay in here, and one of the additional ways is how are you going to use your 3 night assaults that you have in the game to their best advantage. Section 4 is Assemble Operations Column segment, and let's go over to our British camp and take a look at this because this is an option for us here. So back in the first day of the week, we formed an operational column with our supply wagon to bring these supplies up to the tactical camp. Now supplies are going to get replenished on Sunday, which means that next week we're going to have to do that same thing. And what we want to do is to make sure that we have some troops that are going to be able to escort that supply wagon back up to the camp here. So what we want to do now is to send some of our troops back down from the British camp to Fort Amiel so that they're going to be able to escort the supply wagon back up next week. So let's think about what we want to put into that column. So we're going to assemble a column, send it down to Fort Amiel to bring the supplies up for next week. The other reason I want to do this is I want to get some of the troops that are up here at the British camp down to Fort Amiel because then we don't have to use rations from the British camp to be able to feed them. So that's a good thing. This will help kind of give us a little bit of a surplus of rations at the end of the week as well. Now, a couple things we didn't mention in the last episode in terms of these are kind of some of these edge cases. One thing that we talked about how to make an operational column or a tactical column, but there's a couple of other restrictions that I didn't mention. One is if an artillery unit has suffered a step loss and no longer has the function of its horses, which means it's in its flipped over state, they cannot be put into an operational column. So we haven't had that occur, but that is one restriction we didn't talk about last time. Likewise, there's some restrictions on the types of artillery that can be used when you're attacking certain squares, like Majuba Mountain. You can't use field guns in a tactical column that's going to go after Majuba Mountain. But those cases, kind of edge cases, are all spelled out in the rules pretty clearly, and we don't have any of them that really apply right now. So we're going to send General Colley, the 58th headquarters, we're going to send 4 infantry companies from the 58th Regiment, and then 1 troop of cavalry down to Fort Amiel. So let's go move them over to Mount Prospect. All right, so here we are at the north end of the operational map now. We've got Colley and all those troops designated into Mount Prospect. And one thing that we also should have done when the weather changed here is Double Drifts is no longer flooded because the weather is no longer deep mud and heavy, heavy rain. The sun is out and it's only muddy. So we can revert this to shallow, which is good because that means we can get through this and we're not going to get stuck at the double drifts, which would have been catastrophic. So we're all set now for our troops here. We're going to basically try to get Colley to kind of work his way down and hopefully before the end of the week get down to Fort Amiel so we save on rations and they can be ready to re-escort the supply column back up for next week. Now you might be, if you recall, when we brought our troops up to Mount Prospect last time, we had the supply wagon there. The supply wagon in the game is generally considered generic, so once it gets there, you just put it back at Fort Amiel and you just bring one up again the next time. So you don't have to worry about getting the supply wagons back to Fort Amiel. So now we come to card number 5, which is the day assault segment. We're not going to do that, and 6 is record assault, so we're going to skip over that card. We're going to go right into card number 7, which is the morning operational movement segment. Now, the basic move is 4 hexes, but we know the weather is mud. Even though the sun's come out, it's still muddy. So that means our move is 3 hexes. So let's get General Colley and his column moving down towards Fort Amiel here. All right, so Colley's now past the double drifts and they are on their way to Fort Amiel. So now that we've got to do the event segment, we don't have the +1 modifier because we have now conducted an assault this week. So we just need a 6 to get an event. We see what we get here. We get a 3, so no event this turn. We're now up to our ambush segment. The same math basically applies now as it did in the previous turn. We're just too early in the war and we haven't had enough failure really to trigger the ambush segments. So there are no rolls that could successfully apply to this. So we're going to drive on there. Now we go to the afternoon operational movement segment. So let's go and kind of move General Colley closer down to Fort Amiel. Now we're at the afternoon operational movement segment. So General Colley and his forces have a movement of 3. So they are making their way down. The rest of the cards don't apply. The rest of the cards in that tactical column don't apply to us. And because it's not a Sunday, that brings us back to card number 1. So we're going to advance the time to Friday, and now we roll for the weather. And I think you can see how this gets faster as we move along, because a lot of the steps you're skipping, but they're good to have as reminders. Hoping still for sun here. 5. Ugh. So we are back in deep mud. It's good. This was pretty lucky, right? Because we got through the double drifts in the only day where it wasn't flooded in the past 3 days. So that's good for us. Fortunate there. So none of the other cards apply to us until we get to card number 7, which is the morning operational movement segment. It's deep mud, so things are really slow. So Colley's column here is kind of slowly inching their way down towards Fort Amiel. We still should make it, but the deep mud is making it a lot slower trek down to the south. Next up, we roll for an event. We get a 5. Does not apply, so we pass through that segment again. Next card that applies to us is number 10, the afternoon operational movement segment. Again, General Colley and his troops making their way down to Fort Amiel. Only 2 more squares to go, so we should make it this week. None of the other cards apply, so we're going back to the first card in the column again, and we are heading towards Saturday, which is good. We're getting close to the end of the week. Once again, we're going to have to see if the sunshine comes out here. Had so much rain in this game. Let's see what we get. A 3, excellent. So the sun comes out and the terrain moves to mud again. Double drifts are open. I did forget, by the way, when it went to deep mud, I should have flipped that counter over at the double drifts to flooded, but it's back to normal now, so we're good to shallow. So let's continue on with our operational turn. We jump all the way forward to card number 7, which is to move the operational column. Colley now, because it's mud, has 3 movement points, which is enough to get to Fort Amiel. So we are going to put our troops in the Fort Amiel holding box here. So we'll spread these out a little bit by their function. So here we can see General Colley and the troops have arrived at Fort Amiel. They'll be ready to escort the supply column back up next week. And we won't have to feed them out of supplies from up at the British camp. So we'll have a little bit of a surplus up there. Time to roll for an event again. Oh, we get a 6. What is it? Boers raid at Majuba Mountain. If Majuba Mountain is controlled by the Boers, ignore this event. All right, so we're going to discard it because we only control, up on the tactical board, we only control O'Neill's farm and we control the British camp. So we got a little bit lucky that we avoided a raid on the camp there. So another event that we have successfully gotten ourselves past. So none of the remaining cards apply to us. We're back to the next day, so we're going into Sunday. This is where we'll get the chance to see how resupply works. We do have to roll for the weather again. Let's see what we get for card number 2 here. Let's get the sequence right. 5. Goodness gracious, it's so much rain. Now, this could impact us, right? Because we're going to have to try to get a supply column back up next week. So we're hoping for breaking in the rain because potentially our supplies it's going to take a long time, and our supplies could get stuck at the double drifts if it's flooded. And speaking of flooded, let's get that right this time. Let's move down here, and we're going to flip the counter over for the shallows so that it shows flooded. There we go. So let's continue on. Next up is our events. See what we get. A 4, no event this turn. Now, again, one of the things that we're not showing here is how the raids would have worked if one of those had been triggered, and that would fall under the ambush deck, which is kind of modified version of kind of a tactical battle. And we're not going to show that in this just because it's a little bit beyond the scope of this replay series. But again, you get the idea on how everything would flow together, I think. So we come to card 14 and finally something different. And it says if this is operational phase is a Sunday, which it is, we go on to operational card number 15. So now we're going to do the end of the week supplies. So card number 15 is about supply consumption. And there's 3 things that we want to look at with supply consumption right now. Herds, medical supplies, and rations. Now, 2 of them don't really apply to us, but we'll talk about them anyway, herds and medical supplies. If a unit that's mounted, say for example, this artillery unit had a 1-step loss. Basically, that's considered it's no longer horse-drawn. To bring that back up to its full strength and horse-drawn status, we would use a herd there to bring it back up to full strength, to consume one of our supplies of horses. Now, we have 1 available right now, but we don't have any units that need it, so we're not going to use that. Now, for the medical supplies, they serve 2 purposes. Say, for example, we had one of these infantry columns had suffered a step loss, and had lost 1 point of its strength, we could use a medical supply, consume that to bring it up to full strength. Likewise, if a unit loses 2 strengths, it's not eliminated, it gets dropped into this hospital box. We could have used we could use a medical supply to get it out of the hospital. Now note that getting it out of the hospital doesn't bring it back up to full strength. We would have to use another medical supply to do that, and you can't consume, the same unit can't consume 2 medical supplies in the same week. So we would have to bring it up from out of the hospital to half strength, and then next week we could bring it back up to full strength. Now, the supplies that are pertinent to what we're looking at right now, however, are the ration supplies. And basically, any infantry company or reserve unit is going to consume 1 unit of rations. So we're going to make that calculation, then we're going to deduct it. Alrighty, so we have 3 units up at O'Neill's farm, and we have 11 units in our British camp holding box. Headquarters do not count, but any reserve and infantry company does. So let's go up and reduce our supplies to reflect the fact that 11 of these rations have been consumed. So we start with 26 rations. We have to reduce this down to by 11, so we're going to reduce it down to 15. So that's the 10s column, and that's the 5. We're down to 15, and we've consumed our 11 rations. That's good, and you can see now how us moving our troops back down to Fort Amiel has kind of removed some of the strain up here on the British camp, because if we had left those additional units up here, we wouldn't really be building up a surplus. And I feel like early in the game, perhaps a good strategy would be to kind of try to keep the strain up on the British camp as low as possible until you get a chance to build up some rations, because we're going to have quite a bit of reserves, kind of bit of reinforcements coming in later in the game. So I feel like this might be a good strategy. So the only thing left to talk about with this supply card is what would have happened if we didn't have enough rations. And it's actually explained right here on the card, so you don't have to go looking up anything in a book or anything like that. If a unit were unable to have, and this could happen in 2 ways. Basically, if we had run out of rations, there weren't enough to feed the troops, then we would have to roll on this hunger and thirst table. Or if one of the units, for example, had gotten cut off at one of our objectives. Say we had taken an objective like the neck, but then we'd taken an objective like the neck up here, but we had lost control of these, so we could no longer trace a supply line back to the British camp because it would have had to gone through a Boer-controlled rifle fire hex. Then, if that happened, we would suffer hunger effects as well. And if that happens, you roll a die. If it is a 4 or greater, the company or reserves takes 1 hit. So some pretty severe consequences, 50% chance that you could basically take a hit of damage and lose a step there. So card number 16 is the Fort Amiel supply segment. Now, this doesn't apply to us, but let's just kind of walk through how it works. In the first episode, I said that there was a 50% chance that a unit that had made its way back, a damaged unit, a reduced unit that had made its way back to Fort Amiel, had a 50% chance of getting free resupply if it had made it to this Fort Amiel holding box. But the chance actually is a 3+, which of course is a 2/3 chance that it could get free resupply. So if we had a unit that had suffered a step loss, for example, if one of these had been reduced by a point, we could roll a die, and if we got a 3 or greater, it would freely get brought back up to full strength. So this is a good way if you've suffered a lot of casualties, to send them back down here to Fort Amiel. You've got a pretty good chance you're going to get a substantial amount of them back with free resupply. Again, reducing the strain up on the British camp. And we can see again how this interplay between the operational board and the tactical board and the thinking and the strategy around it is so important to playing the game, and how it's, I think one of the really cool things about this game is we'll see now when we do supplies is this interplay. You're playing logistics essentially, so you're not only trying to solve a tactical problem in combat, you're also managing and playing a logistical game to make sure you've got enough supply and reduce the supply strain up at the British camp. And that's a cool thing. I haven't seen games that quite take this level of involvement and depth in supply, and I found it really fun to kind of get into as you're kind of learning how to play this game. Alrighty, so now we're up to the 17th on our operational turn, so it's Sunday afternoon. We're going to load the ox wagon convoy segment. So if the ox wagon convoy counter is in Fort Amiel, which is because it automatically comes back here, we're going to load on the wagons table for each supply and place its counter in its ox wagon convoy box. So let's show how this works. So here is the load wagons table, and at the end of every week we're going to make a roll for each one of these supplies to determine how many new supplies we get in the subsequent week. So we have herds, medical, rockets, case shot, shells, cartridges, and then rations. So I'm going to show how rations work, and then just to kind of keep things moving, we're going to do them all. Now the die roll modifier doesn't apply to us now, the -1 for Orange Free State support. So we're just going to do a straight up die roll. We get a 2, which is not, it's actually pretty good for rations. 2 means 25 rations. So to do this, we come down and we find the ration counter here in the deck, which is 25. We're going to come up here to our ox wagon convoy, and we're going to drop 25 to represent the fact that our ox wagons now have 25 rations in it. So I'm going to go through now and I'm going to roll for the rest of these on the load wagons table, and then we'll take a look and see what it looks like when it's done. So we got some pretty good rolls with our ox wagon. It's going to be a happy day up at the British camp. We got the maximum amount of ammunition, maximum amount of rations there. We got 2 shells. We got 2 case shot. That's a pretty good amount. We got a rocket, which is a rare supply. That's nice to get. 4 medical supplies, the full amount, and then a herd of horses all coming up. So that's a nice, pretty good amount of supplies coming up to the British camp. They're going to be pretty happy as they get into that second week. And with that, we come to card 18, which is the end of the operational phase on a Sunday. And now you can see that the card directs us to go to strategic card number 1. So we're going to play the strategic turn. So like with the operational turn, everything in this game has its own sequence of play deck. We're going to go through the strategic sequence of play deck now. Just follow the top card and we're going to follow them in order. So strategic movement segment number 1 says roll for each of the strategic movement table for each strategic column and move it. However, we can see here from Durban up to Newcastle, we don't have any movements on this, any units on the strategic board, so we would skip that one. Now we go to the reinforcement segment. If reinforcements are due, place in the Durban hex. So up here on the strategic turn board, we do have some supplies coming in. We have some naval unit reinforcements coming in. So let's take them now. We're going to bring them down to Durban. Here's a look at some very interesting reinforcements on the way. A Gatling gun, the rockets are coming into play, and then some naval infantries here. This ship counter just represents how they got here, and this just hangs out in Durban for the rest of the war. So we'll load all these up into the Durban hex. All right, so everybody's loaded up here. Now, the movement on the strategic board is either 1, 2, or 3 hexes, depending upon a die roll. So you can see it's going to take, and we don't move in this first week, so it's going to take 2-3 weeks maybe before these supplies get up to Fort Amiel, and then we have to route them up to Mount Prospect. So it's going to be a while before we see them in action. Now card number 3 is the negotiations segment. So we're going to roll a die here. If the result is a 5 or greater, these negotiations are affected, and we would take this negotiations marker and advance it 1 more to the negative here, which would basically working us way towards, if it ever gets here to Transvaal independence, we lose. And as time goes on, you can see positive die roll influencers to this. If it's January 31st or later, it's a +1. February 28th or later, it's a +2. There's also a negative modifier, which is -1 for each logger presently destroyed. Let's just clarify what that is. So we're back over here on the tactical board. The loggers are these 3 positions north of the tactical board that represent kind of Transvaal Boer kind of supply points and outposts beyond the tactical board. And in order to destroy those, we have to bombard them from locations up here in the tactical board. There's specific ones which can bombard specific lagers. And we haven't talked about those, and we're not going to show those here. But if we could get one of these and bombard one of these, so that kind of creates this incentive for us to move quickly up into here and try to take these out, because that's going to give us a negative die roll modifier on that negotiations and the diplomacy roll here, which would help us out a lot, because left to its own, it's going to progress as the game goes, making it more and more likely that each week we're going to inch closer towards losing the war from the negotiations. So let's go make this roll now and see what happens. Alrighty, so we're hoping for a 1, 2, 3, or 4. We get a 5. That's not good. So we have inched, as time passes, we have inched one step closer towards losing the war here. One thing else to note too, there's a Boer victories marker here. If we were routed in an assault or an ambush, then this gets marked at 1 and that moves it over 2. So there's not much tolerance for failure in this game, for getting routed anyway. And that's kind of the historical outcome, is the British lost, I think it was 3 assaults very quickly early on, and that's what led to them losing the war. So card number 4 in the strategic deck is the Boer Siege segment. Now, if you recall back in episode 1, we talked about historically how the Boer forces had surrounded these British outposts north of Newcastle and the tactical board. And we're trying to break through that tactical board to relieve the sieges on these different towns. The game represents that sometimes during the game, these could fall. If we roll a die, basically you would roll for each one of these towns, and if you get a 7 or greater, the garrison surrenders. If it surrenders, we go back up to that negotiations box and we move the negotiations marker 1 box closer towards Transvaal independence. So we don't want these towns to fall. Of course, we don't want them to lose. Now, there's die roll markers that shows here that basically the siege starts. It doesn't show it on the card here, but it shows it up on the board. This doesn't start until January 31st. And then there's die roll modifiers that come in later. One of them is +1 if there's no British assault at Laing's Neck. So again, making it imperative that we keep up the pressure and keep up those tactical assaults. -1 for rolling for Pretoria. And if Pretoria falls, you lose the game right away. So you don't want that one to go. And then there's a +1 if it's February 28th or later. Now, it doesn't mention it on the card here, but if you go up here to the map itself, on the top, the sieges start on January 31st, so we don't have to roll now. In any case, there's no way we could get a 7 or greater because there's no die roll modifiers that would lead us there because we had an assault this turn. So we're safe anyway, but it doesn't officially start until January 31st. Card number 5, win the war segment. If the British control all 10 objectives, Hill of Doves ends immediately and we win the war. The British win the war. However, we've only got 2 right now, so we have a lot of work left to go, so this doesn't apply to us. We have not yet won the game. Now, the last card in the strategic deck is the end of phase segment, where we advance the strategic time marker. So we're heading into the 2nd week, and then the instructions tell us to go back to operational card number 1. And with that, we come to the end of the first week. Now, there are 12 weeks in the game, and as you go through, basically we kind of repeating the same procedure. And there's the thing they're going to see, we haven't looked at everything here. For example, we haven't looked at night assaults, which are a little bit different. We haven't executed an ambush or one of those raids, which would be a little bit different. But they're all basically extensions over that assault kind of gameplay mechanic that we went through. So there's not a ton of differences there. There are some subtle rule changes and different things there, but you've kind of seen how it works out. We haven't talked about bombarding these lagers up at the top of the tactical board. We haven't really talked about how to use artillery in a bombardment when we're attacking, although we've seen where those cards come up. We haven't used Gatling guns, rockets, and then also some of these squares, each one of these, whether it's kind of the neck here or Table Mountain, those are a little bit more difficult to take. How units come in are all different, but for the most part, you've seen, I think, we've covered the core gameplay and everything that's really involved in the game, and hopefully give you an idea whether this would be something that you would enjoy or not. The things I really like about it so far, I really like kind of the puzzle of trying to solve this tactical puzzle down here in terms of how you're going to attack and which way you're going to go forward. I like the variability from the event deck cards, so you could lose one of your gain objectives at any point in time. Love the political influence, and I really like the interplay between logistics and supply, and the tactical board, how you're balancing your troops and reinforcements and all those kinds of things. So it seems to me like a lot of fun. Now I've started twice. The first time I made a big rules mistake, so I got about 3 weeks into the game. I realized I was making a huge mistake that was making it really hard for me. So I restarted that one. Then I get about halfway through and I had to take the board down because we're having some guests and things like that. And then I also wanted to start to make these videos too, because it's been a while. So I'm looking forward to digging in and playing more. If you do have tips, strategies, and ideas that have worked for you, feel free to share them with people down in the comments below. I hope you have enjoyed this. If you'd like to see another game that we've done the same type of treatment for from Legion Games, you could check out our gameplay demos for Captain C, which involves frigate-to-frigate combat in the Age of Sail. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody, and I hope you have a great day.